Utilitarianism. We're going to go over Jeremy Bentham again and John Stuart Mill, and as well as a division in liberalism as well. These are pertinent philosophers that we've covered in our philosophy playlist. The original leader of the utilitarians, or philosophic radicals, was the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham from 1748 to 1832. Society must be more rational, he insisted, and the first step in this direction is to recognize that people act out of self-interest. Moreover, everyone has an interest in experiencing pleasure and avoiding pain. As Bentham put it, quote, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do, end quote. This is simply a fact of human nature, he thought, and there is nothing that we can do to change it. But once we understand that all people seek pleasure and avoid pain in everything that they do, we can then take steps to be better pleasure seekers and pain avoiders. Bentham did not mean that we should seek pleasure in immediate gratification, in getting drunk, for example, because the pain we or others suffer later will probably outweigh the short-term pleasure. He meant rather that we should seek utility. Something has utility, a hammer for a carpenter, for instance, or money for almost everyone, if it helps someone to do what he or she wants. Because people want to be happy, utility promotes happiness. Bentham recognized that people will sometimes fail to see what does and does not have utility for them. Someone who drops out of school may not appreciate the utility of education, for example. He also admitted that, in pursuing our own pleasures, we may bring pain to others. But the purpose of government is to solve these problems. In Bentham's words, quote, the business of government is to promote the happiness of society by punishing and rewarding, end quote, by punishing those who cause pain to others and by rewarding those who give pleasure. In other words, government can and should act to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people in the franchise. From this, Bentham drew two general conclusions about government. The first was that government could generally promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number simply by leaving people alone. Individuals are usually the best judges of their own interests, so government should usually let people act as they see fit and get out of the way. For this reason, Bentham accepted the laissez-faire arguments of Adam Smith. His second conclusion was that government is not likely to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number if it is controlled by a small segment of society. In the pursuit of utility, Bentham declared everyone is to count equally. Government must weigh everyone's interests, and this requires that almost everyone be allowed to vote. Although Bentham's views on voting are not altogether clear, he did support universal male suffrage, and with that cogency, with certain reservations, the vote for women as well. John Stuart Mill, from 1806 to 1873, his views on this matter are not in doubt, for John Stuart Mill was an ardent advocate of women's rights. An influential utilitarian, Mill was the leading liberal philosopher of the 19th century. And whether supporting women's rights or arguing that government should set minimum educational standards for all people, Mill's greatest concern was to defend and extend individual libertas. This concern is most evident in his essay titled On Liberty. When Mill published On Liberty in 1859, liberalism seemed to have triumphed, at least in England and the United States of America. The old enemies ascribed status, religious conformity, and absolute government were no longer the obstacles to individual liberty that they once had been for so long. Yet Mill was alarmed by what he took to be a new threat to liberty in the growing power of public opinion. In the old days, Mill said, the chief enemy of freedom was the government. But now that we elect representatives, the government is more responsive to the desires of the people. It is responsive, however, to the majority of the people, or at least the majority of those who vote, and this allows them to use the government in order to restrict or take away the liberty of those who do not share the majority's views. Moreover, the majority can bring social pressure to bear on those who do not conform to the ordinary, or those who do not conform to the normalities of society, conventional ways of life. Without going through the government or the law, the moral coercion of public opinion, Mill said, can stifle freedom of thought and action by making social outcasts of individuals who do not conform to social customs and conventional beliefs. Like Alexis de Tocqueville, whose Democracy in America he greatly admired, Mill was worried about the, quote, the tyranny of the majority, end quote. On Liberty was Mill's attempt to deal with the new form of tyranny. There he advanced one very simple principle, quote, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant, end quote. According to this principle, sometimes called the harm principle, every sane adult should be free to do whatever he or she wants to do, as long as his or her actions do not harm or threaten to harm others. Government and society then should not interfere with an individual's activities unless that individual is somehow harming or threatening to harm others. Government has no business prohibiting the sale of alcohol, for instance, on the grounds that drinking harms the drinker, but government should certainly prohibit drunken driving on the grounds that this poses a serious threat of harm to others. Of course, I'm a utilitarian and liberal as far as the wind blows. Mill defended his principle by appealing not to natural rights, as most of the early liberals had done, but to utility. Freedom is a good thing, he argued, because it promotes the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. And by this he meant that both individuals and society as a whole will benefit if people are encouraged to think and act freely. For the individual, freedom is vital to personal development. Our mental and moral faculties are like muscles, Mill said. Without regular and rigorous exercise, they will weaken and shrivel. But people cannot exercise their minds and their powers of judgment when they are constantly told what they can and cannot do. To be fully human, then, individuals must be free to think and speak for themselves, as long as they neither harm nor threaten harm to others. And of course, I want to just briefly mention here that the government, as Mill says, should not have any say in what people do to themselves or their own lives. And so any kind of law, any kind of restriction or regulation that tries to prohibit the free actions of individual people is ludicrous and should be done away with. It is possible, of course, that people who speak and act freely will make others, perhaps even the majority of society, uncomfortable and unhappy. But it doesn't matter if people are uncomfortable and unhappy. The key thing here is to key in on what the term harm means. But in the long run, J.S. Mill argued that the ideas of nonconformists such as Socrates and Jesus and Galileo work to the benefit of society. Progress is possible only when there is open competition between different ideas, opinions, and beliefs, including people like me who are contrarians. And as in economics, a free marketplace of ideas yields a greater variety to choose from and allows people to distinguish good ideas from bad ideas. Without freedom of thought and action, society will remain stuck in the rut of conformity and will never progress. Mill's desire to promote individual liberty also led him to recommend representative democracy as the best possible form of government for a republic. In Considerations on Representative Government, written in 1861, he maintained that political participation is one of the best forms of exercise for the mental and moral faculties. Only in a democracy, he argued, is this kind of exercise available to all citizens. In this respect, J.S. Mill's argument for democracy differed from Bentham's, who thought that democracy is valuable as a means of protecting individuals' material interests. That is, insofar as everyone has an equal vote in a democracy, then every voter has an equal say when voting for or against proposed policies or candidates for office. An equal say that Bentham believed that voters would use to protect their personal interests. Mill agreed that self-protection is a valuable feature or asset of democracy, but he held that self-development is even more valuable, as democratic participation can promote the civic education of citizens by broadening their horizons and sympathies through discussion, debate, and public service, such as jury duty, for example. In this way, J.S. Mill stressed the educative rather than the protective value of democracy. And even so, J.S. Mill's fear of the tyranny of the majority kept him from embracing democracy wholeheartedly. Among the other things, he favored a form of plural voting in which every literate man and woman will have a vote, but some, those with higher levels of education, for instance, will have 2, 3, or more votes. Plural voting thus would enable everyone to enjoy the benefits of political participation, yet allow more enlightened and better informed citizens to protect individual liberty. As for when the majority, as Plato once said, shoot themselves, I guess not shoot themselves, but shoot themselves in the foot with an arrow so as to destroy the very society in which they exist. Such a system was necessary, Mill believed, at least until the overall level of education in the country was high enough to remove the threat of majority tyranny. And as for economic matters, Mill began his career as a staunch defender of laissez-faire capitalism. Toward the end of his life, however, he called himself a socialist, as well as I, and of course this shift in his thinking was one of the first signs of an even greater shift on the part of many liberals in the latter part of the 19th century, a shift that divided liberalism into rival camps. The division among liberals stemmed from their different reactions to the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. The misery of much of the English working class became increasingly obvious, in part through the depiction of their plight in the popular novels of Charles Dickens. Reform movements were underway and socialism was gaining support, especially on the European continent. Some liberals began to argue that government should rescue people from poverty, ignorance, and illness because of their concern for the well-being or welfare of the individual. This group has come to be called welfare or welfare state liberals. Other liberals maintained that any steps of this sort would invest too much power in the government, which they continued to regard as a necessary evil and, indeed, one of the main obstacles to individual liberty. Because their position is so close to that of early liberalism, it has come to be called neoclassical or new classical liberalism. Next, we will talk about neoclassical liberalism, social Darwinism, welfare liberalism, and the welfare state.